This is Judith Lay, welcoming you to Manx Radio and to the podcast of this week's edition of At Your Service. For the next hour, we take a look over the past year to some of the guests we met and the stories they've shared as we've been at your service.
Manx Radio.
We generally start each programme with some music, and the piece I've chosen today is beautifully restful, but with a powerful message. Called The Work of Christmas, it reminds me that Christmas isn't just a short season. Christmas is, in fact, just the beginning. These are the words of theologian Howard Thurman, who was also the founder of the first interracial, interdenominational church in the United States. Although he died over 40 years ago, I believe his words speak powerfully to our world today. When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among people, to make music in the heart.
When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among brothers, to make music, make music from
The Work of Christmas, words by Howard Thurman, with music from Matthew Curtis and balanced voices. We began this year acknowledging some very sad news that touched people in almost every area of island life: church, farming, teaching, and the performing arts. We were all deeply saddened to learn of the death of Marilyn Cannell, a gifted musician who shared her talents so generously and gave so much to the island. I want to acknowledge the inspirational way in which Marilyn shared her Christian faith. She was a popular Methodist local preacher and a regular contributor to our Thought for the Day feature here on Manx Radio. I've selected just one of her many wise and often witty thoughts, mixed with extracts from one of her many musical compositions. Marilyn's Celtic cantata drew together a selection of existing words and music from the Celtic tradition, together with new music composed by Marilyn herself. The singers are Karen Elliott and Mandy Griffin, and the pianist is, of course, Marilyn Cannell.
When the stars shine in the sky, when the streets so peaceful lie, when the darkness is so nigh,
one last big question, perhaps the biggest question of them all. What's it all about? Do you ever think about it? After all, it is the privilege of human beings to do that. I mean, you won't find a sheep contemplating whether its wool is curly enough, or an oak tree agonising over its position in the millennium wood. But we can use abstract thought and reason with ourselves. Or are we all just too busy doing things? I find I need silence for these thoughts, though I must confess that music can put me in the right frame of mind. I can stand and look at the horizon, knowing that the earth curves away and I can't see it, but I know it's there. I can look at the intricate design of a small flower like a crocus and forget all about the cycles and programmes on my fan-assisted oven. I can watch children playing and see their expressive faces, which have far more character than the latest face of Revlon makeup. Whoever or whatever we perceive God to be, we know what he stands for. Something greater than all the cleverness that man can use and manipulate. Things that are good and uplifting in our poor, cynical world. The promise of a better and hopeful future. Peace for the soul. And love. The greatest thing of all. Yes, that's what it's all about.
Here is my heart, Lord. Here is my hope. Here is my love, Lord. Help me to cope. Here is my time, Lord. Here is my might.
Remembering the gifted musician, teacher, Methodist local preacher, and good friend to so many, Marilyn Cannell, may she rest in peace and rise in glory.
Here I am thine, Lord. Bless me tonight.
Springtime brought a visit from author, broadcaster, preacher and teacher Richard Littledale. He's based in North Wales but loves the island and takes every opportunity to visit. On this occasion, he came armed with a new book. It's called Make It Grow and is described on the colourful cover as a collection of projects, prayers and fun facts to help you care for God's planet. And it's very clearly aimed at young people. Richard usually writes for an adult audience, so what, I wondered, had inspired him to write for children this time?
I had detested gardening all my adult life until about 4 years ago when I discovered it in the midst of grief, and it was transformative for me. Absolutely loved it. So I ended up writing a book about it. And when that book came out, I took it to my local nursery, who had been wonderful in helping me to understand what this whole gardening nonsense was all about. You know, I could go to them with a photo of a bit of my garden and say, what shall I put there? And they would make suggestions. So I took them this book, and their parting shot as I walked out of the potting shed was, well, what are you going to do next? Perhaps you could write a gardening book for children. Well, that's a dangerous thing to say to me, because, of course, the cogs started whirring, and lo and behold, I wrote a gardening book for children.
You've got a mix of 10 projects, 10 fact files,
Yeah.
loads of lovely little illustrations. You've even got little spaces for children to put photographs of what's happening in the garden.
It's all about engagement. Now, what we've got at the moment is a generation of children who are more climate aware than you or I have ever been, but they're also more climate anxious than you or I have ever been. They're worried about this stuff. So if we can put a book in their hands that says, well, look, here's at least 10 things you can do to make a difference in your own back garden, I think that's a very powerful thing to put in the hands of parents and grandparents and friends, where they can sit at the kitchen table, flick through and say, well, which project number shall we do today? And it might be something as simple as making a rain catcher, so that you catch the rain and then you use that to water the plants because it's better for them than your tap water. Or it might be something a little bit more complex, like making a pond out of a container, or one of the projects involves putting tiny, tiny plants into the crevices in walls and pavement where they will grow despite expectations. So it's about giving them things they can do that are manageable with clear instructions. And then, of course, it starts to become fun and you start to learn.
Even making compost, you've got the correct recipe, and then, obviously, putting the compost on the plants that they've been growing.
Yeah, so these are all manageable things. They're not very expensive things either, and that's important. I used to get very defeated as a child when I would get these books of, 20 different things to do on a rainy day, and you'd open number 1 and there'd be 15 things on the list you didn't have in the house. And Mum and Dad gave you the book because they wanted to occupy you, so the last thing they wanted was to go shopping and buy all these things. So most of these projects will cost very little to do, and that was the reason I chose them. There were so many I could have chosen, but these 10 are all accessible. And each of them is combined with something to pray about and a little bit of the Bible, and then, as you say, interwoven through the book are all sorts of fun facts. I had such fun researching those.
You've kind of anticipated my next comment, because you've got this lovely bit that says, and then there are some things to talk about, and you might like to come in from the garden, wash your hands and get a drink. But that is the bottom line, isn't it, Richard, that you want youngsters to sit down with an older person and just reflect on what this all means.
I do, yes, because, say, there are all sorts of other voices telling them to do that. Whether it's Greta Thunberg or it's the politicians or it's David Attenborough, lots of people saying that you must think about what you do with the world. But it's a little bit scary. And something that you can talk about with mum or grandma or granddad over the kitchen table, well, now that's a bit less scary. In fact, one of the ones, I think it's the one you just mentioned, it's a project to do with reusing water. But with that one, I say, when you come in for the garden and wash your hands, don't dry them, so that as we're talking and praying, you can feel the water drying on your hands. Because it might make you think about those who are desperate for a drink and who don't have one.
You can go as deep as you want with it, can't you?
Oh, it can be a springboard, yes, and some children will want to take it to that next level. There's another project in there to do with buying mixed seed. You can get mixed seeds in any garden centre or even in a supermarket. But before they go and plant them in the garden, they tip them out on a white dinner plate and see how different all the shapes are. And then when they've grown them, they see how different all the flowers are. And the conversation with that one when they come back into the house is, think how different the people are that you meet at church or at school. How different they look, how different they seem. But they're all valuable, and you could take that conversation as far as you wanted it to go. And I also think there are a number of grown-ups who would love to have their child or grandchild help them in the garden. They're not quite sure how to make that fun, not quite sure how to make that interesting, and I really hope this will help them.
Thank you, Richard Littledale. And because we're in the season of Christmas, and so the right time to sing our carols, let's listen now to Aled Jones and Sir John Rutter's composition, What Sweeter Music Can We Bring Than a Carol for to Sing the Birth of This Our Heavenly King.
What sweeter music can we bring than a carol for to sing the birth of this our heavenly King? Awake the voice, awake the string, dark and dull night, fly hence away, and give the honour to this day that sees December turned to May. That sees December turned to May. Why does the chilling winter's morn smile like a field beset with corn, or smell like a meadow newly shorn? The sun, come and see the cause why things thus fragrant be.
With his sunshine.
heart, which we will give him and bequeath this holly and this ivy wreath, to do him honor, who is our King and Lord of all Israel. What sweeter music can we bring than a carol for to sing the birth of this our heavenly King, the birth of this our heavenly King.
We started this year without a resident bishop. The process of finding a replacement for Bishop Peter following his retirement in October 2023 was well underway, but until a new appointment was actually made, it was the Right Reverend Mark Davies, Bishop of Middleton in Manchester, who had responsibility for the Diocese of Sodor and Man. Bishop Mark became a regular visitor, clearly keen to meet as many people as possible and learn about church and secular island life, and he seemed to be enjoying every minute of it.
My visits here have been such a blessed time, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be with you again.
It's a busy life though, isn't it? Because this doesn't let you off being the Bishop of Middleton, does it?
No, it's both and that's great, and thank goodness for things like email and electronic forms of communication that keep us all linked up, both when I'm in Manchester, having good contact here on the island, but also when I'm on the island having good contact over in Manchester.
Now you've made a couple of visits over here, and of course geographically the places are very, very different. Do you see similarities in the diocese?
Yes, I think there are. There are so many things that unite us as the people of God in prayer and worship and service, in nurturing the faith and in reaching out to our communities, making a significant difference across this island as we are seeking to do across in Manchester also.
Here you come and look after business things, the things that we don't really see but keep the diocese running smoothly, but also have opportunities to engage with the people, confirming young people, which is what you're doing on this visit.
Yes, which will be an enormous privilege. So yes, we have the business things, doing those things that the bishop has to do, but also an opportunity to meet people pastorally, to have an opportunity to pray with people, to listen to their story, and then to have the great joy of confirming a number of people and to celebrate that very important stage in their discipleship as they receive the gift of confirmation. They'll profess that baptismal faith at the very heart of the services, that profession of faith for themselves, and then the prayer of confirmation, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit for them, so that I know with all my heart that they will go out from that service as great ambassadors for Jesus Christ. They will carry that faith with them. They will carry that baton of faith, of hope and of love, and be transforming in all the ways that they will live out the faith. They will be ambassadors of Christ-filled hope.
At the time that we had this conversation, the issue of the bishop's vote in Tynwald was a hot topic for debate. And so I asked Bishop Mark what he hoped that people would think about when reaching their decision.
I think the well-being of the island and its unity and the way in which history really, really matters. Not as a thing set in aspic from the past, but as a living thing today. And the bishop in Tynwald, for me, speaks of an opportunity for service and a commitment to service. There we have Tynwald, the longest continuous serving parliament in the world, of which the bishop has been a significant player all through that time. And going forward, it's an opportunity, as I see it, an opportunity for service. The Bishop of Sodor and Man is here for the whole island. It's a ministry of service for everyone. Not just for Anglicans, not just for those who come to our churches, but for everyone. And so I would hope people would remember that and see it as a very positive way in which the bishop has contributed to island life over the years. I think one of the great privileges of a bishop's ministry is the sheer diversity of conversations that we have day in and day out, week in and week out. And for the bishop to be able to represent some of that in Tynwald is, I think, a significant opportunity. But also, I think, for the bishop to build opportunities to enhance the ways in which the bishop is themselves informed. What are people feeling? What are people saying? What are the concerns of the day? And how can the bishop speak into that? So I've had a number of conversations during my last visit here. I jumped on a couple of buses and just drove around and had conversations with people. They didn't know I was the commissary bishop or any such. But just to listen, what were people concerned about? They were concerned about health issues, about issues of the economy, things that are affecting them and their families. And so I think the bishop's commitment to listening as well as speaking is vitally important, and how the bishop is informed in the view that then is shared in Tynwald is really important.
In May, it was announced that the then Archdeacon of Westminster, the Venerable Tricia Hillas, would be the next Bishop of Sodor and Man. She travelled to the island for the announcement, and during her very brief visit was interviewed by Manx Radio's Beth Espy. For me, the standout moment came at the very end of the interview, when Beth Espy asked the bishop-elect what she'd like to be called once she becomes a bishop.
Most people would normally call me Tricia, and in due time, Bishop Tricia. But I have heard that there's this little moniker going around about Trish the Bish, which did make me roar with laughter. And I've said, I so have to get that T-shirt. But I think the fact that if someone's talking to me at all, that's the key bit. I just want to be able to be known and to be known by people. So, yeah, whatever you want to call me, just call me is the key bit.
The process of consecrating and installing a new bishop takes quite a while, so although we knew her identity back in May, it was October before Bishop Tricia began her ministry on the island. But on an almost daily basis, she's being true to those words from her very first interview. She doesn't stand unnecessarily on ceremony. She's keen to meet us and learn about what we do, and to become an authentic part of island life.
We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord. We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord. And we pray that our unity may one day be restored. And they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. We will walk with each other, we will walk hand in hand. We will walk with each other, we will walk hand in hand. And together we'll spread the news that God is in our land. And they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love.
We often talk about the need for the church to be truly aware of the needs of society, to be active in our community. And to be honest, I feel we sometimes say it as if it's something new, when in fact one of the bravest and most effective examples of the church playing a real part in transforming its community was around 50 years ago, not so far from us, on Merseyside. 50 years ago, Liverpool was an immensely troubled area with a dysfunctional local government, high unemployment and serious social unrest, a place of decline and division. In 1975, it was into this area in crisis that two newly appointed church leaders arrived, within 6 months of each other. They were Roman Catholic Archbishop Derek Worlock and Anglican Bishop David Sheppard, both sent to lead their respective denominations on Merseyside. For a unique insight into how this partnership came into being and why it was so effective, let's listen again to Jenny Sinclair, the daughter of Bishop David Sheppard.
So I was 13 when we moved up, and that was 1975. And Derek was appointed Archbishop of Liverpool 6 months after we arrived. So my father knew who was coming, And on the night that he knew Derek was arriving, he went round to his house with a bottle of wine and rang the doorbell and introduced himself. And it's important to say that neither of them had really been ecumenical before this time. There wasn't a track record of working across differences before. But I think they both knew, for different reasons, that they had been called there around the same time. And this was the action of the Holy Spirit in their lives. So Derek told me, just before he died, that Pope Paul VI had given him a double mandate for that job. He said, I want you to stop Liverpool becoming a second Belfast and to work with the poor and unemployed. And he'd been down south in Portsmouth. So he came with those specific intentions. My father had been in London. Having been originally a conservative evangelical back in the 50s, he had shifted to becoming quite influenced by what we call the social gospel, which is a church that's interested in social issues. So he'd already become quite political by that stage. He was the chair of the Martin Luther King Foundation. He'd been a leading campaigner in the anti-apartheid movement, for example. So when he came to Liverpool, he was very attuned to the unemployment, which was very severe. There was what they call capital flight. There was withdrawal of investment around that time. In years later, we discovered from when the Thatcher papers were released that the government was actually pursuing a policy of managed decline for the city, but nobody knew that at the time. So at the time we arrived, 1975, the local political leadership, local government, was very dysfunctional. And there was a kind of vacuum of leadership. And I think the bishops, they kind of became default community leaders. And they decided right from the beginning to work together. And they felt called by God as brothers in Christ. That's how they described it. They spoke on the phone every day for 22 years. They never broke any rules in terms of doctrine. They never took communion together. This is not allowed in terms of the Catholic rules. And they felt the pain of separation. That's the way they described it. But they were absolutely devoted to this partnership. And they did many things in public together. And they were warned, actually, by some who were very worried about the sectarian undertones of the city. Some people at the beginning said, don't touch this, it's too dangerous. It's like lifting the lid off Pandora's box, leave it alone. But they decided together deliberately to ignore this and to be very explicit and upfront about their what they would call a civic friendship across difference. And as this partnership between him and my father really settled and grew, and this is through the late 70s now, coming up to sort of 1980, 1981, and there were riots and so there was very, very serious stuff going on in Liverpool and across the country, social unrest. Their partnership turned out to be really significant for the city, standing alongside poor communities, negotiating between, say, the police and the black community, between business and unions, and across the divide, across the sectarian divide. And as they pursued this partnership, the sectarian divide kind of healed. They did many things together for the city, like they helped to start Liverpool Hope University. They were instrumental in bringing 3 teacher training colleges together to save them, and they steered that through to start that university. They set up the Liverpool 8 Law Centre. When the city went through deep tragedy, like the Hillsborough disaster, for example, in 1989, it was like the whole city wanted to mourn, and they held big public requiem mass, for example, in the Metropolitan Cathedral the day after the disaster. They both spoke at Anfield. It's a strange thing nowadays. We're in this very secular environment now. They were actually held in great affection by the people, even people who didn't go to church. They were like, oh yes, those guys, they were on our side.
I think we need to also mention that the moderator, John Newton, was also a part of this partnership. Although it was your father and it was Archbishop Derek who were the very visible partnership, he was always there and he was always giving his 100% support to it.
He was, and they really valued his role in it. In fact, the press were terrible. The press used to crop him off photographs, and so they deliberately put him in the middle of them so he couldn't be cropped out. But he was a wise man, and he was a great friend of theirs, and he was involved for quite a number of years. But there were other church leaders as well. There was Salvation Army, there were Baptists, there were other denominations as well. And actually, as a result of what they did, it enlivened the sort of Churches Together movement across the country.
That's Jenny Sinclair, daughter of Bishop David Sheppard, former Anglican Bishop of Liverpool, whose work, alongside Roman Catholic Archbishop Derek Worlock, played a critical role in the renewal of a city in decline. As a teenager, Jenny was, by her own admission, a bit of a rebel. She turned her back on the church and left home at the age of 18. Following marriage and a profound conversion experience, Jenny eventually joined the Roman Catholic Church. But after living quietly for some 20 years, working and raising a family, she was eventually persuaded to start exploring the Worlock Sheppard legacy and considering, with others, what might be learned from their experience that might be relevant for a new generation. And from these discussions, the charity Together for the Common Good was born. And this is how they explain their aims. The common good is the shared life of a society in which everyone can flourish. The common good is something we build together. It fosters community spirit and strengthens the bonds of social trust. It transcends party political positions and welcomes all faiths and none. You can find much more information on the charity's website, togetherforthecommongood.co.uk. Someone else who thinks along similar lines was my guest in November, and a number of people contacted me afterwards to say how moved they were by listening to Chris Lane. Chris is a tutor at Emmanuel Theological College, which trains Christians of all denominations for service in the church. But that's only part of his work. He planted a pioneer church in inner-city Salford in Greater Manchester around 25 years ago and still co-leads the church today.
I'm from Salford, just near Manchester. We work in an estate called Langworthy in Salford, and when we moved into the estate 25 years ago, it had a reputation of being one of the roughest areas in terms of crime, deprivation in the whole area. It was in the national news at one point for a police chief talking about the feral gangs of young people who used to run riot around the estate. And we just felt like, whilst everyone was moving out of the area, there was a third of the houses in the estate that were empty because people couldn't cope with living there. We felt like God wanted us to move in rather than move out. And so a bunch of me and my friends 25 years ago all bought or rented houses in that estate and really just committed ourselves to living and working alongside people to see change happen. At first, people were like, who are all these weirdos that are, moving in? I mean, I'd always lived within a mile of Langworthy, but a different world, really, where I grew up in Salford. And I always wanted to avoid the area because there was these two gangs that kind of, did lots of crime, lots of kind of antisocial behaviour. And so it wasn't a place you would want to walk through, let alone live in. I think there was definitely a welcome to us, but also a scepticism. Like people said, you'll be here for 2 years and then your money will run out. And not that we had any money, but like they'd had an experience of people moving in wanting to do good deeds, and then they're there for 2 years and then they leave. And people said to us, you'll not last more than a couple of years. And 25 years later, we're still around.
So did you arrive badged as a church? How did you present yourselves?
No, we were part of a thing called Eden that the Message Trust were running. And basically the idea was people were moving en masse out of the inner cities in Salford and Manchester. And they wanted the Christians especially to help to reverse that and try and encourage people to move into the tougher areas. So me and a bunch of my mates were going to move in anyway. But then we did a little partnership with the Message and they recruited a whole bunch of extra people. So in the end, there was 25 people who in 1999 who all moved in together into about 4 or 5 streets. So it certainly had quite an impact and things started to change. But it was quite a scary place to live for the first 2 or 3 years. Fireworks posted through the front door, and I got home once and my front door was lying on the settee and someone had been around the whole house. And we had all sorts of experiences like that. But the big thing for us was working with the young people of the area. We'd spent 4 or 5 years praying for that estate and asking God to give us his heart for a place and wanting to make a difference there. And it just felt like the natural thing for us. We wouldn't just go in there for a week here and a week there, but we would live. And so a lot of it was just living our lives in a place, shopping in the shops, and then eventually raising our children in the area, sending them to the local schools, working in the schools. So we had a couple of school workers who were paid to go into the local high schools and do assemblies, RE lessons, different things like that. We opened a community centre called the Life Centre in the year 2000. And again, on the day we opened, people came in to look, and a couple of people said, this will be burnt down within 6 months by the local young people, and it's still there 24 years later. And we just started a number of initiatives with children and young people. So I could spend an hour telling you all about them, but there's basically, whenever there was some kind of need, we would try to address that with a project that included local people working with them for change for the good. When you become neighbours and not just do-gooders who come in from the outside, it makes a huge difference. So if there's a crime wave that happens, you all experience it together. I think quite quickly we found people considered us to be part of the community with them. And we very deliberately were like, we're not the saviours to come and sort it out. We're just belonging to this community. And it's about looking for people who have ideas, people who want to see social change happen, and getting alongside them as well and helping them to do the things that they want to do. And I think after about 3 years, the community began to change and there was enough people who gathered. So there was a tipping point where there was enough confidence where people would say, actually, we don't want to see this antisocial behaviour. We want this to be a good place, a positive place. And so I think in those days, as we would partner with different community groups and activists in the area, we did begin to see really solid relationships built. And as we worked with young people and children for all those times, you also then get to know their families, you visit them in their homes, and then you gradually build trust over a number of years. It doesn't come in the first 6 months or 2 years even, but it does come when you show a commitment and a love for an area. And I think after 4 years, a number of people started to come to faith and want to be a part of a church. And at that point, we felt like, well, why don't we start a new church, which was called Langworthy Community Church, to help those people who are from the area to kind of grow in their faith, really.
Do you think the people who might possibly have wanted change just get ground down? There are a lot of good people there, overwhelmed by a smaller group.
Absolutely the case. There can be an arrogance sometimes in people coming in from the outside and saying, we're going to sort it all out. And we absolutely don't have that attitude. We were one of the catalysts in seeing change happen. And I think having a group of people who are actively, passionately working for social change brings out others in the area who perhaps have been scared by what's going on, and it gives them a bit of confidence. The first Labour government in 1997 put a lot of money into the inner cities, and that made a difference as well. The police did some really good work. We certainly don't tell the story that it was all about us. We were definitely a catalyst in seeing social change happen, and I think it was lovely to see a community begin to stand up for itself again.
Because the worst thing that happens without an influence in that kind of community is you produce second and third generations in the young people who know nothing other than joining a gang to survive.
What you just said is so important, the role models. So we went into the schools early on when we first moved in and said to all the kids, who are your role models? The two most common ones were Ryan Giggs, Man United player, and a guy who's the local gangster, Paul Massey. Those two are the names that came up again and again. So one of the things we realised from the start is it's fine to have a footballer as a role model, but most of the kids will never be professional footballers. Also, a local gangster's not a good role model either. So one of the things we did in all the primary schools, we did this community course where we bring in local police officers, counsellors, midwives, church leaders, all to tell their stories to the kids. All these people had grown up in the estate and then had gone on to do these different roles. And just to say to the kids, here's a whole bunch of different role models, different outcomes that you could go after. You know, even getting the police into the classroom to know they're not a threat to you, they're people who want to work for the good. You could be a police person one day, and just lining up this whole series and telling a different story. And gradually, you see change come over a number of years.
What does the estate look like now, today?
Compared to 20 years ago, when it was incredibly hard place to live, It's a vast, incredible change that's happened. There's still poverty, but it isn't ruled by fear like it used to be. One of the things we do is called Langworthy Live, which is a music festival once a year, and we have all the shops open the doors and become venues. So like we have a string quartet playing in the laundrette, and we have a jazz musician playing in the kebab house, and a Michael Jackson impersonator in the church. And it's just this amazing thing where people come from all over the city, whereas you used to go away from Langworthy to like have fun and enjoy yourself. Now people come to Langworthy to find joy and hope and hear the stories of what God's doing and what the community are doing. That's the one thing we prayed at the start, that it would change so that instead of everyone aspiring to leave, people would aspire to come. And we've seen that in a number of ways. And that kind of little music festival, that watching the street come alive with all of these people going from venue to venue, listening to great music, having a great time, finding joy, hope. That's what we're all about in our community. It's not like heaven on earth, but we have glimpsed heaven on earth. We've seen lives transformed. We've seen addicts set free from their addictions, and we've seen people physically healed when we've prayed for them. And even in kind of more ordinary ways, there was a bunch of lads who were a part of our football team for years, and a few of them came up to my brother recently and they said, if it wasn't for you running that football team and including us in the church stuff, we'd all be in prison now. And all of them, each one of them are doing really well. You know, they've got good jobs, and it's those differences that you make. It's not just the spectacular stories, but those little things where they could have gone this way and instead they've gone the right way. And gradually, slowly, seeing a place turn round for the better.
A few times during this past year, I've included features from the archives, exploring the history of some of our churches and chapels through the excellent series called Keystones, produced and presented some years ago by the former Vicar of Moraun, Reverend David Bush. We've also met people who've made an exceptional contribution to church life on the island, like Norman Barron, who was born in 1909 and was well known as the postman in Kirkmichael. But he was also a Methodist local preacher for around 40 years, only sitting down when he was in his very late 80s, as he explains to David Collister in this conversation recorded in the year 2000 when Norman was aged 91.
Well, it's funny how you get into these things, really. My father-in-law was a lay preacher. He did quite a bit of preaching. And as he got older, he says to me, will you come and read the hymns out for me and read a lesson for me and so on. Well, this happened a few times, and I went with him to a little chapel at Ballylike, Michael, there one afternoon, and he let me do the first part of the service, and then he said, well, I'm going down now, you carry on, he said. Here I was standing like a stop, wondering what I could do next. Yeah. Fortunately, it was about the parable, the prodigal son. So I spoke on that for a little bit. What I said, I don't know, but I suppose nobody would ever want to know again, perhaps. But funnily, from that, you see, he reported it to the superintendent minister in Ramsey, and they put me on note, you see. When you're on note, you go out with a local preacher, you see. Oh, yes. And then when they're satisfied, they put you on trial. They eventually put me on trial. Well, I felt I could do a bit of this, you know, to be all right. So I got on trial, and that meant I had to take exams, of course. Oh, yeah. There was 3 exams, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and worship. And I got through the 3 all right, yes. Well, satisfactory enough to put me on full plan. I got established then as a fully accredited preacher, as they call them. Yes. I was fully accredited in 1958. So I went up preaching until 2 or 3 years ago. The chapels that have disappeared since I started, well, I don't know, there's more than I could count on both hands in the Northern Circuit. Yes. And sometimes I would take 2 services, you see, afternoon and evening. Well, I had to walk or cycle in the early days because I didn't have a car then. And then eventually they used to plan it so that we could travel with somebody with a car eventually. Mr. Frank Crow was a captain of the parish, a member of the Keys at that time, and he used to do quite a bit, so we travelled with him, or we travelled with a Mr. Sam Corkle, who lived in Ballacrega Farm, Michael, and they took their cars, and then they would give us a lift and drop us off at a chapel, you see, and then pick us up on the way back, you see. I was very keen on picking hymns suitable to the service, or sermon rather. Yeah. I was very keen on that.
When you did your sermons, did you write them beforehand?
I did, yes. Yeah. Some people don't, but I found I couldn't cope with it unless I wrote them all out. Yeah. And then, of course, I referred to them, keep referring to them, yes.
How long did a sermon have to be? Was there a set time?
Well, I always thought to myself 20 to 25 minutes. But I think that was getting a bit long for some of them, so I started to cut them down a bit. Quarter of an hour or so, I think I found was acceptable to most places.
Did you go back to certain subjects more frequently?
No, I'd be guided by readings for each Sunday. I tried to take a sermons from those, you see, yes. Yeah. But I've seen me till about 2 o'clock in the morning, getting the window for fear I wouldn't have a sermon for Sunday.
I was going to say, because it would actually take quite a long time to write.
Well, you've got to concentrate on it, and I think it's gone too much theology now. In those days, there was 1 or 2 old men, and they were great men too. Willie Tearcock, Michael, he was a great preacher. Just a layman, just an ordinary layman, but he was a wonderful preacher.
I heard the voice of Jesus say, I am this dark world's light. Look unto me, thy morn shall rise, and all thy day be bright. I looked to Jesus, and I found in him my star, my sun. And in that light of life I'll walk, till travelling days are done. I looked to Jesus, and I found in him my star, my sun, and in
It's been so very difficult to decide what to include in this programme. Each guest has been special in their own way, and this is a good moment to thank everyone who's kindly spared the time to be interviewed. I really do appreciate your help. And I think we've just time for one more story from another of the contributors to our little Thought for the Day feature that used to be heard every weekday morning and night here on Manx Radio. When Peter Shimon, a lay reader in the Anglican Church, joined the rota, he'd been recently widowed, and to help him cope with bereavement, he'd got a puppy, a lurcher called Jacko, and Peter always managed to make thoughts about his faith link into the challenges and the joys of life with his new companion. Listeners might not have readily remembered Peter's name, but they were always keen for more stories about Jacko. Earlier this year, Peter told me that Jacko had died. And as so much of his life had helped us to pause and reflect, I asked Peter if he'd like to share a final thought for the day inspired by his life with Jacko.
Jacko died of a heart attack. He was nearly 13 and had a good life, but we miss him. Looking back, what strikes me is how different he became after I moved to Andreas. What made the difference? When Jacko and I lived down south, though very lovable, he was known to be over boisterous, even a bit wild. I remember when he pinched another dog's ball and ran off every time I tried to get it off him. Most embarrassing. Another time, I got in my car, put my seatbelt on. It came up in my hand. He had chewed it right through. He escaped from my garden and chased a cat up a lamppost, and an old lady rescued the cat. I had to renew the fence round my garden to make it Jacko-proof. But Jacko gradually changed. He became such a gentle, friendly, well-behaved dog. What made the difference? I have to say he still had his moments, especially if he saw a cat. But with people and other dogs, he was always so friendly and gentle, and very rarely even barked. He was no guard dog. Everyone was welcome in his house, even other dogs. So what made the difference? I don't think it was the move up north. So what was it? I think it must be getting married 5 years ago. My wife Sylvia was always loving but firm with him. I think her influence gradually changed him. Jesus, if we invite him into our lives, will make a difference. Because he died for us on the cross, we are freely forgiven our misdemeanours. And Jesus rose again and gives us the Holy Spirit to inspire us and help us to live the way he wants us to. But we will still have our moments, as our old human nature is still within us. But Jesus will transform us, giving us love, hope, purpose, and an eternal destiny.
And now there's just time for a few items from the notice board, and we begin with 2 invitations from Union Mills Methodist Chapel. This afternoon at 2:45, there'll be a selection of Christmas music and readings led by the Meadowside Choral Society, followed by refreshments. And then, also at Union Mills Chapel, there'll be a watch night service on Tuesday the 31st, New Year's Eve, starting at 11:30. It'll be led by Reverend Dr. Janet Corlett, and light refreshments will be served at the chapel from 11 p.m. onwards. Looking ahead now to next Sunday, and St Paul's Church in St Paul's Square in Ramsey is the venue for a united service for all the churches in the parish of Ramsey and the North East. That's next Sunday in St Paul's Church in Ramsey, starting at 10:30, and it'll be led jointly by Reverend Ian Foulds and Reverend Joe Dudley. And also next Sunday, St Andrew's United Reformed Church at the St Ninian's traffic lights on Glen Crutchery Road here in Douglas have a service of Holy Communion next Sunday at 11 a.m, at which the preacher will be Mr Theunis Bassage. And I'm afraid that's all that we have time for now. But I'll be back later with Sundown, waiting at the door to welcome you into our virtual lounge tonight from 9 o'clock onwards. I usually say it's easy listening music, but I've been told it's loungecore now. But whatever it's called, it's you and your requests and dedications that really matter. So I'd love you to join me if you can. I'll be back next Sunday morning at our usual starting time of 9:30 with the first edition of At Your Service for 2025. And it'd be good to have your company as we start a new year together. But until whenever we meet again, this is Judith saying thank you for listening, and I wish you and those you love a happy, blessed and hope-filled new year. Blaen Vai Noor, and a very good morning.